Could you give me your name and your job title, please?
Tim Wigmore, also Cricket 2.0 and a sports writer for Daily Telegraph.
Beautiful. Can you tell me about Fabian Allen's base?
So for this piece,
That sounds rude, doesn't it? It sounds like I'm asking something really weird.
so for this piece, we were basically looking at, there's obviously lots on kind of bowlers and their, how they need to develop physically and stuff for T20, those demands, and this was looking at the other way for batsmen, which we don't really talk about. So I talked to Fabian Allen for it, and he talked about this exercise he's got from Andre Russell. And basically what Andre Russell does is he bats in training with cones just in front and just behind his legs. And the idea is he has to hit the ball while not touching the cones forward or back. So he has to be very, very stable when he's hitting the ball. And it's a way of developing his base and flexibility. And Andre Russell told us Fabian Allen does this a lot. It's one of his favourite drills. And Fabian Allen also, he's very big on core strength. So he says a lot of going to the gym is actually a vanity project. Weights are not really that important for batting in T20, but what's really important is having that strong base. So he regularly does 400 push-ups in a day, which is
Same.
It's kind of exhausting to think about, actually.
Well, the interesting thing about that is I remember when that changed within West Indies cricket. So it wasn't that long ago that the West Indies players, the other players from other countries used to laugh at them because they all looked like they had beach bodies. And cricketers don't really have that. I remember Mitchell Johnson, when he retired, suddenly he got like this incredible, like different kind of physique. And he said, and he put a tweet up going, "Oh, it's so good. I've now got a beach body after years of having a cricket body." And specifically, and I've forgotten the name of this trainer, which is really going to annoy me, but he's a former SEAL from Barbados, and he was working with the West Indies team, and he was saying that they all were doing all these heavy weights, and I think it was Carlos Brathwaite and Chris Gale with the two, and he just said to them, "You're strong anyway. You don't need to do that. What you need is core." And that must have been about 5 or 6 years ago now. And some players had already gone towards it before then. But it's quite clear that core strength has taken over from weights. So it's very rare now to go into a gym and see a player actually pumping up the way that Robin Utapa used to do.
Yeah, I think if you were a weightlifter and you were trying to do a scoop, it would be fucking freaking impossible because you couldn't get down the time, you couldn't move, and you couldn't hit a wide Yorker because you couldn't move. So yeah, a lot of these guys, it's not the strength that they need to work on per se; it's having that core strength and that flexibility, so you can hit 360 from actually a wide range of different positions. And that's been an interesting kind of cultural shift in sort of T20 training, from kind of training to look good on the beach, to training to be what's most effective for actually your job, which is to score runs.
Just a perfect example of all that is Chris Tremlett when he played in the seniors tournament, and some of the other England players were like, "Look, he looks incredible, but we're not sure he's going to be able to field a ball because he won't be able to bend over and pick it up." Obviously, he's doing bodybuilding now. Anyone wants to look up those photos, they're more than welcome to. Something else that you talked about in this piece was how power comes from the back hip. You talked about a Liam Livingston story.
Yes, and this is actually a good example of coaching getting better. And because we're still only 18 years into T20, so actually the kind of knowledge of it is still kind of in its infancy a little bit. But as we get coaches who are smarter, that will really help players a lot, because they'll be able to say, do this particular thing. So the story is that Liam Livingston, before the England-Pakistan T20 series last summer, he was doing some work with Paul Collingwood and Marcus Trescothick. And they basically noticed his legs were a bit too far apart in his stance, which kind of meant he was wasting some of his power and he wasn't kind of going through enough. And because you're meant to kind of use your back hip for power, but if you've got too big a gap, that power is kind of going to be lost, and you're not going to be able to transfer it into the ball very efficiently. So he was losing his momentum from his back hip, and then by narrowing the gap between his legs, he's able to use that more efficiently. And he goes on an amazing spree at 13 sixes and 68 balls against Pakistan in this great century. And he's almost like a tennis server, where he kind of has the kind of weight on his back leg, and then he explodes into it. And he actually, that six from Harris Ralph, that famous one when it's into the rugby league ground at Headingley. But actually, he kind of, after he's hit it, he kind of carries on acceleration forward, which is something you'd probably see in baseball, but not traditionally in cricket. And that's quite a good example of that. Obviously, Livingston guy's got a lot of power, but it's actually that coaching and that knowledge that's probably helping him to kind of use that in a more efficient way. And I think that's going to be a really important trend going forward, that as you see coaches who are actually thinking through the T20 prism rather than this is what we always did in Test cricket, blah, 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 that's going to really help batters to not actually get more powerful, but to use their power more efficiently, which I think is the key point, because there's very few players now. There's always no one who you think they cannot hit 90-meter, 100-meter six. It's how do you get yourself in a position to be able to do that as regularly as possible, and how can you be smarter with kind of using what you have?
Yeah, John O'Wells is, I think, the best example of that. Looks like he cannot hit the ball anywhere, but he has actually hit sixes, even if he only hits one every 48 balls. And occasionally, when he gets in the right position, he still does it. There aren't many John O'Wells left in cricket, though. Most players can hit sixes far more regularly than that now. You talk a lot about Bryson DeChambeau, which I think is how you pronounce his name.
Bryson DeChambeau, yeah.
Chambeau, is it? I thought it was Chambao.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's got a hell of a name. Which, if nothing else, I'm glad he made it to the top level of professional sports with such a name. Who's a golfer who basically, I don't think we've even had. I can't think of a single cricketer that's ever sort of changed themselves as physically and their training practices as much as he did. Even someone like Benny Howe still prepares like a normal cricketer. He just has different deliveries. Whereas basically he changed his body just to make himself from a normal golfer into a power golfer, which wasn't really a thing before.
Yeah, so he gained 40 pounds in 9 months. So he was actually he was starting this before COVID happened, and then COVID happened. He's like, I might as well use this time. This is kind of handy, because you can gain weight in a way that you didn't have to practice golf all the time. And then he increases his average drive from 302 yards to 322 yards in the following year. So that's a massive, massive increase, the highest ever. And he goes on to win a major of the US Open for the first time ever. And actually, he dipped a bit this year, but there was kind of worry that he'd kind of hacked golf and he'd kind of ruined golf with this. But he'd found a way to just hit the ball, his drives a lot further, which clearly is a huge advantage. While actually the rest of his game was just as good. And this is actually kind of a good example of what's possible. And of course, part of that thinking is not just about when you middle the ball, it going for six. It's also if you're stronger and more powerful, there's more chance of a not middle ball going for six, which obviously gives you a massive advantage. You don't even need to hit a perfect shot and you still get the best outcome.
You talked to Julian Wood for the piece. So Julian Wood, for people who don't know, is a very controversial figure in cricket. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard. Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard more negative stuff about a coach outside of maybe, I was going to say Ian Pont, but I don't even think that's fair. I think probably the most controversial figure. Julian Wood basically is what I would call a hitting coach. He doesn't really care about batting. He cares about batting, swing speeds, and all these sorts of things. He talked to you about overload training, which is something that's very big in baseball, which is basically using heavier bats and using heavier balls to overload your body.
Yeah, he is a controversial figure. I think he's probably for reasons. Cricket's not used to a figure like this, and there's always going to be this sort of distrust about outsiders and people who, they've been doing their jobs the whole, in the same old way, and they kind of resent this guy coming in. And B, some of his methods are a bit maverick and so on. And so also because there's not many hitting coaches, it's hard to evaluate how good one hitting coach is. But what's cool is he is a trendsetter, and I think we'll see more of these guys in the future. But either way, but yeah, what he does with the bat, he basically gives his 3 extra kind of bats, which he gives players 20, 40, and 60% heavier, and he's trying to train them in hitting those. And the idea is very simple. It's overload training. Is if you practice harder than the exam, in this case, the cricket match, the match itself will seem easier. So if you can hit a ball at 90 miles an hour with this ridiculously heavy bat, which is obviously hard to kind of wield in a nimble way, well, that means when you're hitting with your normal actual bat, that suddenly seems a lot easier. And that's one of his principles. He also goes the other way with underload training, which is basically when you use a ball that's a bit lighter and travels further, and that's partly actually to kind of for the rhythm of swinging. It's also partly actually just a confidence thing that if you have this ball, you're absolutely smashing it. I think the psychological value of all this stuff is still quite interesting as well.
Yeah, and you see this sort of stuff a lot. I mean, in baseball, you see batters with either like a ring around their bat, swinging in practice, and golfers for years used to use 2 golf clubs before they would play a shot. So it's not it's a lot of this stuff isn't particularly new. It's maybe just been a little bit more scientifically tested. And in Julian Wood's case, he's saying that there's almost two kinds of batting. There's batting and then there's hitting. And so what they're really trying to do is make sure that everyone has those sort of fast hands and that incredible swing plane of someone like Andre Russell.
Yeah, well, he argues that we won't really get the full benefits until counties in England, state teams in Australia, state teams in India. They, rather than saying you're in our academy, they actually have a red ball academy and a white ball academy, and you get that complete spin. Now, that's quite a controversial idea because there's also the kind of ideas you need the fundamentals of batting and then you develop and then you specialise. But yeah, he certainly thinks all of coaching is based around, have you got a good forward defence? Can you kind of nudge a single through the covers or whatever? And he said, no, we need to think in a different way. You kind of learn to hit, and if you have that, kind of that's maybe all you need. It's only forward defence in T20. It's kind of nice to have, but unless T20 World Cup, you probably do need it on these pitches against these bowlers. But you can be a very good T20 player without being able to play the forward defence, which is kind of nuts to think about.
Well, I mean, the forward defence almost doesn't exist realistically that much in cricket. There aren't that many players who actually, against 90 miles an hour, can plant on the front foot and not get their pad in the way anymore with DRS. So, I mean, the shot is going away. I remember Stephen Fleming said years ago that, what you really want to do is find a player who can attack and you can teach them how to defend on the back of that, which is a fairly, I think there are a lot of more coaches coming through now who feel that way. I think that if you are facing Rashid Khan and you are facing Shaheen Afridi, you need some batting skills to go with your hitting skills. But I think we also underestimate, guys like Andre Russell and Kieran Pollard who actually have a lot of batting skills. But then when they just need to stand there and hit, they can. But what you might get is that, the difference of someone like Asif Ali, who is probably never going to be able to actually bat, but he can hit, four sixes and 7 balls, which is also quite handy, I hear. Rajasthan do some interesting drills. I mean, we're talking about stability through Fabian Allen, and Rajasthan do some interesting drills about almost trying to get their players off balance.
Yeah, so I talked with John Gloucester, who's worked Rajasthan all the way since 2008. And they do some kind of odd things, such as basically trying to practice hitting when you're overbalanced and stuff. And again, it's all based on the kind of premise of your core is what matters, and kind of running into resistance bands and kind of jumping and hopping on one leg. And the idea is actually kind of priming you to cope with being unstable and being able to hit from a very kind of imperfect position. And actually, that buys you. Again, if you're late to see that there's a wide Yorker and you thought it was going to be a bit straighter, well, maybe you can still improvise and still you can get a boundary. So that's all kind of interesting stuff that's being done.
Did you talk to any of the batters who had used that method, or
in terms of that training?
Yeah. Just because I can't think of any. I reckon I've heard of people discussing that before, but I don't know if I've ever heard a batter say whether they felt that was useful or not.
So I know it's so different, but Mumbai, they talked about Hardik Pandya, and he does a lot of stuff with heavier bats and weighted balls, for example. So that's kind of a prominent player who is using it. I think it's Colin Ingram does a lot of this sort of stuff as well. I think he apparently has a kind of it's several weighted and heavier balls which he kind of takes around with him and hits as well. So yeah, it's being used, and I think obviously it's individual as well. So I talked with Liam Livingston, and he was like, actually, I mainly just do range hitting and hit, but he's very big on stability and core strength on that side. But he doesn't kind of necessarily buy into this other stuff that's being done, the overload and unload stuff, which is a bit funky and a bit more controversial. So I think there's obviously there's different ways of doing it, and it's not like you need to do this one thing and you'll be able to be an amazing power hitter. It's a lot more kind of individual and complex than that.
I actually want to talk about range hitting. Range hitting is really interesting. So I interviewed Ricky Ponting a few years ago about the changes in ODI cricket, because Ricky Ponting was one of the first players who came into ODI cricket thinking it was a serious sport and then got really good at it and obviously dominated the sport. And I basically interviewed him on all the different players. So he didn't see much of Jarrod Meandad, but obviously Dean Jones was the person he put he based his career on. Then there was, Michael Bevan and Sanath Jayasuriya. Like, he was there for all of those big things. And I was asking him, like, what was that, what was the time when he realized it was becoming more about hitting than anything else? And it was that, I'm pretty sure it was 99 World Cup. They turned up for a training session, the Australian team, and they went out, and Lance Klusener was out on the pitch doing range hitting. And they'd never seen anything like it before. And they're just the Australian players are just sitting there watching Lance Klusener going, oh, this sport is changing. Like, things are changing. So it's really, that's a long time ago before, and range hitting really doesn't become a big thing. I reckon most of the teams still weren't doing it at the 2012 World Cup. Because I remember Chris Gale did it and we filmed it for Crick Info. And he was doing it on this small ground. And there was it was in Sri Lanka, and he was trying to clear a grandstand. And like there were all these roads there, and we were thinking, someone's going to die. He's just going to hit someone on this road. And he was they had all these metal roofs, and you could see him trying to hit the metal roofs, which were 70, 80, 90, 100 meters away. And he was getting them, of course, because it's Chris Gale and someone was tossing the ball down. But it's interesting how some of these things have been around for a long time, but it's taken the players a little bit longer to commit to them. The other thing that you talk about here, which I find really interesting, is the different kind of body that you now need to be a test player than a T20 player.
Yeah, so we've never really kind of thought about what goes into. We always think, if you're a good batsman, you're a good batsman, but the demands are really, really different. So it's actually mainly Cricket Australia, which is probably unsurprising given they've generally been at or kind of near the forefront of kind of sports science in cricket. So there was an interesting study from them running the Big Bash in Sheffield Field, and it's basically high intensity sprint, which is 24 kilometres an hour or more, is over twice as frequent in T20 as in first class cricket. And there was a study from Queensland Cricket as well. And they found that you only cover 29 meters per minute in first class, but 62 in T20s. And interestingly, actually, probably what kind of surprising in some ways is that they analysed it for keepers, fast bowlers, spinners, batters, and they found for batters it was actually the biggest physical difference in terms of how much they were covering and stuff, and the kind of sprinting and stuff. So actually, the demands seem to be more different for batters than for other types of players, so I certainly wouldn't kind of necessarily assume.
And you looked at a Sanju Samson innings that went through the Rajasthan team where he made, was it 50 or 60, and he didn't hit many boundaries, and he ran 10 kilometers. And the next game he went out for nothing and ran 5 kilometers. Like, there's a big jump up if you make runs, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's interesting for teams becoming aware of this, and actually that's have an impact on fielding positions as well. Because if you're fielding first, and you've got especially a kind of an anchorish player who's going to run a lot of singles and twos, you don't want them running a lot because they can be exhausted by the time it takes their turn to bat. And equally, if you're batting first and a guy gets 70 or 80, well then you need to think about what's the best fielding position for them, which generally is going to be close in because they're not running as much, but actually even that is dangerous because that's a position where if they're a bit slower, that could be potentially turning 5 doubles into singles over the course of an innings. So yeah, that's one of the real things, and it's also the kind of it's a kind of, you need high speed and you need high endurance. So it's really brutal. It's kind of probably like being a top tennis player where you need to be able to last for potentially 4 or 5 hours and also do all the sprinting as well. So T20 is hugely physically demanding. It's not just, if you just have the explosiveness, not the endurance, well, that's not going to get you very far either. So you need to be actually a very impressive all-round athlete. And yeah, there was these tests that Rajasthan did of how fast their players run, and Josh Butler running between the wickets ran the equivalent of 33 kilometers per hour. And if you kind of extrapolate that's the equivalent of doing 100 meters in 10.9 seconds. Usain Bolt's record is 9.58. So, and that's with, obviously, Josh Butler's doing that with pads as well. Obviously, he's not doing 100 meters, but the point is that cricketers are now serious athletes. And I think we still think, obviously, you still find the odd, people find an image of Rakeem Cornwall and they say this shows that, cricket is a joke, you don't need to be fit. And it's really not true at all. Like, the demands are really, really big now. And that's something I never thought about actually, was how long does it take to run a 2? And the top team, interesting teams, Mumbai and Rajasthan, they're testing this. So Mumbai said, an elite, the elite time to run a 2 is 6 seconds as a striking batter. And for a non-striker, it's 5.5 seconds, which actually, we talk about man-padding and stuff, but actually, that 0.5 seconds is really important.
Yeah.
And basically, you're never going to run out for a 2 if the ball comes back in more than 6.2 seconds. So this is really, really tough, really, really intense. And actually, we're seeing So Paul Chapman, he talked about how actually they now do a lot of work with players, which is probably long overdue, on turning between, turning for runs and stuff, and how to basically, if you maintain a low body position as you guide in your bat, that gives you, and then you decelerate as late as possible. That seems to be the best way to kind of run your bat in and flip back. But even this 20 World Cup, we've seen a number of one run short and stuff. So players not always doing this properly. So this is a really, really, really big thing as well, which again we probably hadn't really thought about.
Well, I reckon I wrote about running speeds between the wickets something like 10 years ago, like very early on in my career, because it was really quite obvious that was something that you needed to know. Like you needed to know who was quick and who wasn't. And it really, Nathan Lehman was one of the first people who told me that England had really started doing it. I've got a feeling that Mark Wood might be their fastest over a two, or he's in their top 2 or 3. But yeah, Stokes, Butler, and Bairstow were all on that list as well. Obviously, very, very fast. But it's incredible to me that even to this day, teams don't seem to train players how to run between wickets to the level. There's lots of like micro things within cricket that, like, I always think, why are bowlers not trained on caught and bowled? Like, it's a really important thing, and not just caught and bowled, because they won't all be catches, but how to field, and these days probably how to dodge the ball as well, in some situations. And it's like there are lots of little micro things that cricket is just getting to now, where I think that people in that 60s and 70s probably on occasions were training and were working on some of these things, but it's never become wide practice.
And the point is, if we're recording and testing all of these, this actually helps teams to be more efficient in how they're assembling. There's not much point, and you still see this quite a lot, where you have a really, really fast runner with maybe the slowest runner in your team, and it's like, well, you're not getting any of the benefit from this guy. Actually, especially in the middle overs, if you want to pair up 2 of your fastest guys together, that's really a more efficient way of doing things. And if the batsmen are kind of equally good in different way in other ways, then actually it should be their running speed between the wickets. That should be a big part of how you assemble your batting order. Otherwise, you just have this fast eye and you're not making the most of it. And so it's pointless. So that skill is being wasted. I think that's something that I think teams not really think about, but they really should be thinking about that.
Well, weirdly enough, we had this. My first job was at Lucia. When
you had Cornwall and Dave Warner opening together, which is pretty much talk and cheek.
Exactly. So we knew that we had to use Cornwall up the order, and we had a sit down with David Warner, and I can't remember who was in the meeting, but Pollard might have been there, but Warner was there and Brad Hodge was there, and I said we think we should open with Cornwall, and Warner was like, yeah. Andre Fletcher might have been there as well because he was the other opener, and they were both like, yeah. And I said, but the problem is that, Davey, we know that you score you get started in your innings by 2s and 3s, right? So if we put Cornwall at the top, how is that going to affect you? You're going to have to think about your batting differently. And I think in the end, we might have actually gone with Fletcher and Cornwall for that reason, because Fletcher was more of a boundary hitter than Warner was in the first few overs. And that allowed us to do that. But we had to have that conversation with David Warner, because otherwise the first game he's out there,
he's getting run out. Yeah,
exactly. And when you talk about different kinds of, this is something I find really, really interesting. So when people say, oh, it's not a fitness game and all this, and they put up a picture of Rakeem Cornwall. Rakeem Cornwall is such a phenomenal physical athlete that he got a late call up to the NFL, 2 or 3 years ago, to be whatever it was, the blocker, one of the people that hits people in the NFL, despite the fact he'd never played that sport before. He's an incredible athlete. But all of his athleticism is a completely different kind of athleticism to Joe Root's, right? He's not an endurance athlete, but for about 4 seconds, he actually does move quick for a couple of steps as well, a bit like Jesse Ryder used to. But he's not going to run you your
2s and 3s. No,
he's not going to give you a 2 in 6 seconds, right? But the power athlete, and that's the thing that's really interesting, because I think what we're finding now is that you need a different physicality for batting in different spots in the order. So I always think back to guys like Michael Lum and Robert Utapa, who did get really, really big and bulky, right? You probably only want them to score 30 or 15 at the top of the order, but you might want them to be batting with someone more like David Warner, who can run the whole game and still give you some power options. And then later on, you probably want Andre Russell type athletes who are not going to get you that many 2s, but are going to clear 6s. So the physicality of batting positions might actually change.
Yeah, so Paul Chapman, so he's a guy from Mumbai, strength and conditioning coach, and he thinks batting positions will become more specialised from a physical perspective. So again, you might have your power hitters who can't necessarily run their twos particularly quickly. You know, at 5, 6, 7, you might in the middle order you have guys who can run their twos in 6 seconds or less, and so on. And actually having, and it's very hard to be able to do both because these are actually quite divergent physical demands, and cricket's just not used to that. I mean, the physique to be a good batsman in Test cricket, it's no different whether you're an opener or a number 7, really. Like the kind of fundamental physique you need just does not change at all. Whereas for T20, it changes massively. So yeah, I think there's scope for sort of specialisation within specialisation, and also what's interesting is whether I'm doing another piece on this actually, but I've got a theory I think you might have as well that generally, if you look at the history of cricket, most of the elite batsmen have probably been slightly lower than average height. And I think as power becomes more important, I think the height of players seems to be trending upwards. And so therefore height, it's not that you will not be able to be a very good batsman if you are under 6 foot, but actually it will now be a proper advantage, and we'll see that the proportion of top batters who are 6 foot plus is going up in T20.
Well, let's talk. Let's pre-write that piece for you because there's a bunch of stuff on this. One of the reason that I think one of the reason that tall batters faded a little bit more from the game, because if you go back, I don't think WG Grace was particularly short, so there had been taller batters, but the bouncer, right, was the big thing. Because I always remember this being talked about with Tom Moody, and Tom Moody, I've seen people.
Moody's what, 6'7"?
Yeah, 6'6", 6'7". I remember people talking with Tom Moody recently and slagging him, going, "Oh, he's just an Australian who was a big hitter." It's like he made 77 first-class hundreds. Like he was a very, very skillful batter. But the thing with Tom Moody was, if you're 6'7" and you're a batter, how do you practice against the short ball until you're 20? Because chances are you aren't going to face bowlers who are quick enough consistently.
So you're hitting a load of long hops.
Yeah. And so what happens is if you're James Taylor, you're basically facing bouncers from the age of, from the age of 10, because anyone can probably bounce someone who's, I mean, what height would James Taylor be when he was 10? He probably would have been 2'4", right? It's easy to do that. And I remember even playing cricket in my level, and we played on synthetic wickets where it was easier to bowl bouncers. You had a lot of guys who were shorter who played the short ball better earlier on in their life, just because they had to, because they were really short. And us taller kids who, like I was my full height at like 12. So no one, for me, I had to learn to play the bouncer when I got to senior cricket, basically, because when I was in junior cricket, no one could ever get the ball up to my height. And I think that is a big part of it. Whereas in T20 cricket, that part has left, right? So you physically have that. Also, the other thing that you really wanted was before, I mean, we're now talking about people having this big, strong base, right? That wasn't what you wanted before. Look at Bradman. Bradman is forward, he's back, he's to the side, he's moving around the crease. He was really, really quick at moving around the crease. And my assumption is that someone like Hobbs would have been quite similar. There weren't many bigger, stronger hitters. You've got a couple of the West Indians, obviously, and you've got Wally Hammond is another one. They were often seen as more one-dimensional players. But as we go forward in cricket, one-dimensional batting is probably, for certain roles, is going to be more important. So you're going to want to see more bigger, stronger people like that. But you can see it in that thing. If you look at my Ben Dunk video, I show photos of early Ben Dunk, and I show photos of late Ben Dunk. Like his physicality completely changes, right? Like he was always a bigger kid. Like he was never going to be a skinny guy. But the way he went from being that to being a big power athlete in his shoulders and his chest is quite clear that there's a change there. And you could see it all the way through. I mean, one of my favorite things is to put up a photo of Corey Anderson and to put up a photo of Don Bradman, right? It's not just height, it's size and physicality. And if you can't bowl bouncers as much at these guys, it means that I think that's a big advantage for taller players. And also, as bowlers get to 90 miles an hour, you can't make 2 and 3 movements if you're a short guy, right? So you can only make one movement. So if you want to smother their length, being tall is much more important than being short, because you can't get as far forward or you can't get as far back. So all those things that generally for short batters were an advantage before are now more of an advantage for tall batters in limited overs cricket. What will be interesting is in 10 years' time, whether Test batters are still shorter than T20 batters.
Yeah, so you talked about with pace bowling, and I agree with that. Some of the people I'm talking to, they talk about the importance of being able to drive on the up against it
Mm.
with the new ball, and they think if you're taller, it's easier to be able to do that. Interesting, but I think spinners, it's a very interesting kind of example of this. So imagine if you're kind of batting day 5 to save a test match. If you're a really tall guy and the pitch is ragging a bit, there's like a lot of bat, a lot of glove. There's men all around the bat. There's a lot that can go wrong. It can rear up, and actually defensive batting there, maybe being on the shorter side is an advantage. But if you're trying to get down the pitch and smash a six, actually, if you're tall, that is an advantage. I think with spinners, I think being taller generally is an advantage in T20, and it's possibly the opposite in Test.
Yeah, I think if you look at the history of cricket, the other reason that so many batters were shorter is because the ball didn't bounce that much, right? The original pitches weren't as hard and as fast, and the bowlers weren't as quick. So if you look at the original wicket keepers and the original batters, they're way shorter than even now. Now, sadly, we don't keep data on this like, they
we
do in
don't
American
keep data
sports.
very much with cricket.
No, it is quite sad. But if you look at the photos of the original wicket keepers, the reason they had to be so short was the ball quite often rolled along the ground, right? Whereas now you also need to be tall because you need to be able to take the flyers that go up, and you need the wider wingspan, especially in T20 cricket, of a wicket keeper, because you want to be able to go sideways because there's never going to be any slips, right? So you need to be able to do that. So my guess is that the physicality of those positions have been changing probably even before we noticed it. And there are other things that you talked about there. Like I think it used to be that if you had a tall batter, they weren't as pushed because they were seen to be more, the sort of stuff that you were talking about. But the other thing is, if you're a tall batter, it's only one step to get down to get past the rough sometimes, whereas a shorter batter might need 2 steps. But on the first day of a test, when the ball is bouncing more, you might actually want to be a taller batter to be able to handle that. Whereas on the 5th day, when the ball's keeping low, it's harder to go low if you're tall. So all those things are really interesting. And then with T20 cricket, you're going to want flexible batters who can move around the crease. So eventually what we're going to be looking for is I don't know what, Giannis Antetokounmpo type freaks who have the skills of shorter guys.
The unicorns, yeah.
Yeah, the unicorns, but have the heights of someone else. It's a really, where it will go, and the specialization of all this that you've been talking about there, will we get to the point of baseball where we have, regular players who are in the team because of their running between wickets? Because I know of one already, Sachin Baby, basically at RCB, one of the reasons they got him in was they thought he was the best guy at getting singles and getting their guns back on strike.
Which makes sense. But yeah, so this theory at the moment, kind of working theory, is that being tall is most advantageous if you're an opener or you're a finisher. So you might get those physical profiles being different, and you have your more traditional kind of batters in the middle who you not necessarily kind of really, really tall, and your really tall guys open or batters at 6 or 7. And so it's like, actually you could get a guy who's 19, 20, and they could be like, you've always been a finisher, but actually you're not tall enough. We need to remold you. If you want to be an elite cricketer, you've got to be a number 4, and you've got to do this role. And it's kind of like your height might begin to predict your role inside of it a little bit, which has never really happened before.
I can't wait for undersized finishers to become a thing. I'm coining that now before it even comes up. There's a couple of other really interesting things here. So St. Lucia was my first job. And other than learning that there are certain seats on the bus that you're not allowed to sit in because Roddy Estwick has already claimed it, and West Indians particularly, I am told, are very, very superstitious with which seat they have in the bus, which I found out very early on. The other thing that I had, we had a bit of a dodgy bus in one of the venues, and behind me in the seats was Mitchell McClenaghan, who, I don't know how tall he would be, but 6'3", 6'4", fast bowler, obviously.
Big guy. His legs are just straight into your back.
Well, no, he kept saying, can you fix the chair? And we couldn't fix it. And so he basically had his legs up his ass, the whole time that we were on a bus because my chair wasn't working correctly. And he wouldn't change chairs, of course, because why would he do that? Because this was his lucky chair as well. The reason I bring up all that is that Mumbai have taken out huge rows of chairs on their buses, especially on their longer journeys, because of this very fact. They're now thinking about the rehab of their players based on and on the trips to and from the game, which is not the case in a lot of these T20 leagues around the world. I can promise you.
And And again, it looks like it's quite a basic stuff, but yeah, so they were in Abu Dhabi last year for the IPL, and a lot of their games obviously in Dubai and Sharjah, so a fair amount of traveling. And yeah, Paul Chapman, he basically realised that this time is sometimes an hour and a half back to Abu Dhabi, and it was dead time. In fact, obviously, if you're not starting to recovery, you have to kind of, it makes the recovery process then harder when you do start recovery. So that this was not just dead time, it was damaging their players. So actually, yeah, he took out every other row, so suddenly you've got leg room for Kieran Powell and Hardik Pandya and so on. And the players also put on Normatec boots, which are these, they're quite hard to explain, but basically they're these sort of special boots which go all the way up, and they use compressed air to massage a player's legs and help their recovery. So they look a little bit like ski trousers, and they keep these boots on for 40 minutes when they're in the coach. So suddenly, rather than the coach being a time when you get a bit stiff because you don't have enough leg room, it's actually a time when you're used to help your recovery. And it's, yeah, it's good for power, it's good for strength, it's also just good for not being injured and being fit on the park. And these are all some ways quite basic things, but we're going to see this more and more. But I've also been at the forefront in terms of giving players Aura rings, which basically record their sleeping patterns. It's quite big in the NBA and other US sports league, and we're seeing it more now. But I think one of the really, really interesting and really one of the big things I think for IPL teams to think about more in terms of advantage is even with the new 10-team season a little bit longer, you still have 9.5 months a year when the players are not with their IPL teams. They could be anywhere, and it's actually how you can use that time properly. Mumbai have started with their SPS. So Paul Chapman, he and his team, they try and talk with their really young Indian players, especially every month, even more than that, and actually getting a sense of what your players are doing when they're not with you is really, really important, because you might do all this work on a player and then they come back a year later and they've kind of gone back and they've ignored everything. So Mumbai, they try and get all their players. They've got a kind of an app on Microsoft Teams, and they try and get players to kind of so I'll update this every few weeks, which records things like how well they're sleeping, soreness, and everything, and try and get GPS data on their training and matches. And it's actually, you can use that way. You can use that time when you're not with players in a productive way. That's a massive thing. And I think generally T20 teams are not doing this anything like enough. But it's the IPL teams who actually have the clout to be able to do that. In the small leagues, they're probably just not paying the players enough for the players to kind of to buy in. But if it's like your IPL contract depends on you turning up for the following season, X, Y, and Z, you're meeting these criteria, otherwise you're not going to be in the team. That's actually when you'll start to get these really, really big improvements. It's almost going to be like, a preseason thing in football, where if you turn up out of shape, you're in real trouble. I think that's clearly one of the big things for teams to kind of to get ahead of.
The sleeping stuff's really interesting. As you said, the NBA teams have been on it for, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years now, and it's become a bigger deal in the NBA. I remember one player telling me that before he went into the IPL, he'd train himself, because essentially what happens in those leagues is you actually have to change your sleeping patterns. So if you finish at 11, some of those games finish at like 12, right? At night, you've then got to go back. Everyone's got to have showers. There's probably some press. Yeah. So you're not getting back to the hotel before before 1 in the morning. Then you've got the relaxing time afterwards, whether you want to drink, whether you want to party, whether you want to play video games, whatever. The very earliest most players are getting to bed is 2 and 3 in the morning. And that's the very earliest. In the CPL, it's famous for players not getting to bed before 5 and 6 and 7, because it's a bit more of a party league and you're in a fun place and you're in a resort and all those sorts of things. That is actually way different to what first class cricketers do. It's completely fundamental. And I know that there's a lot. I don't think teams have ever worked it out, but I know that test teams have talked about the same sorts of things with when their players play the day-night tests as well, of having to learn how to sleep, in different environments at different times. One of the things that I found when we were with St. Lucia is the breakfast was pointless, right? If you finish, some of our games were starting at 9 o'clock at night, right? Because our owner wanted later night games because he wanted the games to be shown at breakfast time in India. So we were playing at 9 o'clock at night. So if anything happens in that game, you're finishing at 12:31, right? Then by the time you get back, it's 2 a.m., right? Any decompressing time means you're not going to bed before 3 or 4. Breakfast in most hotels is over by 11 a.m.
Yeah.
Right? It's simple things like that happen again and again, and and teams are not always just working that out, and it's a hard thing to be able to work out. Oh, okay, what you need is a breakfast chef, who works a late shift, who comes in when the you know, at the hotel, when the hotel breakfast is finished, just so that people have you know, that option for them. Because what you really don't want is the players then getting up and going, oh God, we'll just go out and get some takeaway. You don't really want them going out and getting crap food at that time. You want them to be able to eat really good food. That's the level of which I think the IPL teams are getting to, but the rest of T20 cricket is probably still a little bit removed from. But sleep is such an important part because we have completely different schedules for different formats of the game, but also the games that start at different times.
Yeah, and actually on the diet point, traditionally like teams might have like, even though they had a set, they'd be like, this is what the team eats. But actually, even within batters, the sort of food you need, depending on your role, whether you're a power hitter or a guy who hits a lot of twos, that's actually really different as well. So you need to have Mumbai they had personal nutrition plans. I think they're sort of not dogmatic in those. There's a bit of flexibility, but like, yeah, I was told that Kieran Pollard, you know, has a lot of, loves his fish with veg and a small amount of carbs, and that sort of does all right for him. But yeah, that's like a really big thing as well. And you think in Premier League football, actually, some top players, they actually just pay for themselves to have their own chef who lives in with them. And actually, from the point of view of actually, it's a relatively small investment to put you in the best frame of mind. And if you're 5% better in the IPL, that's probably worth $100,000 a year. So that's already paid for the chef.
Just to go back on that and to finish up, it was Chris Gale and Carlos Brathwaite started traveling with their own personal trainers for the same reason, because they knew that it was a small investment for them, but it would, you know, for their base price, how much money that would be worth long term. And it wasn't that any of the fitness trainers and any of the teams were a problem. It's just that they're at this team, and they're at this team, and they're at that team, so that they just needed that. Tim Wigmore, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Cheers, Jarrod.